Life often feels like a race. We're constantly running to work, 2 meetings, 2 deadlines, only to come home tired, confused, and wondering, is this really what life is all about? Now imagine a single object that can teach us how to live wisely. A glass jar empty at first, but filled with meaning. This is the story of how a simple classroom demonstration became a guiding light for countless people around the world, transforming the way they live, love, and dream. This is not just one story, it's many. A story of a professor, a story of his students, a story of people they influenced, all connected by one powerful lesson. Let's begin. The last class was a cold Monday morning in spring. Professor Armand had been teaching life philosophy at Hillcrest University for over 35 years. This day marked his final class before retirement. Instead of carrying a lecture book, he walked in with a glass jar, some large rocks, a bag of pebbles, sand, and a flask of coffee. Students whispered, "Curious today," said Armand. "I won't speak from theory, I'll speak from experience." He placed the jar on the table and began filling it with large rocks until it looked full. "Is it full?" he asked. "Yes," said the students. He then poured in pebbles. They slid between the rocks. "Now," few nodded. Then he poured in sand. The grains filled the tiny gaps. "Now?" the class chuckled. "Yes, now it's full." Then he took the coffee and poured it in. The students burst into laughter. Professor Armand smiled. "This jar is your life. The rocks are the important things. Your family, health, dreams. The pebbles are your job, your house, your education. The sand is the small stuff, distractions, meaningless worries. And the coffee, well, no matter how full life seems, there's always time for coffee with a friend." That was the end of the class, just the beginning of the story. Maya, the burnout Maya, was one of Armand's brightest students. But years later, working as a corporate lawyer in New York, her life was chaos. 12-hour workdays, no time for friends. Her mother's calls went unanswered. One day, Maya opened an old notebook from college and found a sketch of a jar. It hit her hard. She made a change. Quit her job, moved closer to her mother, started her own legal help firm for abused women. She replaced pebbles and sand with rocks. She chose fulfillment over burnout. Ravi, the broken dream Ravi, always wanted to be a musician. Family pressure pushed him into accounting. Married young with 2 kids, he buried his guitar deep in a closet. Years later, after attending Professor Armand's memorial talk, Ravi took the first step. He joined a weekend music group, then opened a small music school. His weekends became his joy. Slowly, music filled his life. His kids joined him. The house was filled with laughter and guitar strings. He had made space for his rock again. Lena, the regret Lena, an elderly woman in a retirement home, often stared at the sky, whispering, "I wish I had." She had spent her life chasing perfection, a spotless home, perfect appearances. But she never pursued her dream of writing children's books. A volunteer once shared the jar story with her. That night, Lena took a pen and began. At 76, she published her first book. Her eyes lit up every time a child read her words. David, the millionaire who felt empty. David had built a tech empire. He had yachts, mansions, and private jets. But one evening, alone in his giant house, he felt hollow. While flipping TV channels, he came across an old recording of Professor Armand's final lecture. The jar, the rocks. David broke down. The next morning, he called his sister. After years, started a charity for underprivileged children, sold his yacht, and built a school. He finally felt rich. Asterisk Sarah, the young widow Sarah, lost her husband in a car crash. Everything blurred. She lived on autopilot. One day her daughter Emma came home from school, excited about something. "Mommy, my teacher showed us how life is like a jar." Emma explained it to her with childish enthusiasm. Sarah cried for the first time in months. She picked up a pen and made a list. Her daughter, her health, her late husband's memories. These were her rocks. She began living again. Asterisk Jorge, the soldier's promise before deployment. Jorge had heard the jar story from his college mentor. He promised himself if he returned, he would live fully. After surviving a tough tour, he came home, married his childhood friend, started a small coffee shop, and spent evenings playing guitar for veterans. He had seen life nearly slip away. Now, every day, he filled his jar intentionally. Annika, the overachiever Annika, was a perfectionist. Medals, scholarships, trophies, she had it all. But her relationship suffered. She missed her best friend's wedding due to a business pitch. One night, she dreamed of a jar, overflowing with sand, spilling over the sides. No space left. She woke up with tears. She reconnected with old friends, visited her parents, started painting again. Achievements were good. But now, they no longer came at the cost of love. Asterisk Nav, the boy with the empty jar. In a crowded Indian town, lived a 12-year-old boy named Navin, who sold flowers on the roadside. He never went to school, but he listened carefully to every conversation around him. One evening, a group of college students sat by his stall, discussing the Jar of Life lecture. Naveen listened in silence. That night, he took an old glass jar he had found in a dumpster, cleaned it, and placed a few stones inside. One for his mother, one for his sister, one for his dream of studying one day. From then on, every flower he sold was for a purpose. Years later, with help from kind strangers and his own determination, Naveen became a school teacher. He kept that same jar on his desk, dusty but full, and told his students, "Even if you start with nothing, you can choose what to fill your life with." Maria, the refugee who found her rocks, Maria had fled her war-torn country with nothing but a backpack and her young son. For weeks they moved between shelters, unsure of where tomorrow would come from, in a foreign refugee camp. She met a volunteer nurse who taught English using stories. One day the nurse shared the Jar of Life tale, moved Maria deeply. Her life had been shattered, but she realized she still had her son, her faith, her resilience. Those were her rocks. She began rebuilding slowly, learning the language, taking small jobs, volunteering. 10 years later, Maria opened a women's refuge center and became the one telling the jar story to others. She said, "Even if your jar was broken, you can glue it back, piece by piece." Kai, the billionaire who disappeared. Kai was a billionaire tech entrepreneur in Tokyo. His every day was scheduled to the minute. He lived in luxury, dined with celebrities, but hadn't seen his parents in 3 years. One day, while waiting for a board meeting, he saw a child drop a jar and cry. A nearby street artist picked it up, filled it with stones, and said, "You see, life is like this." That sentence triggered something inside Kai. That night, canceled all meetings, booked a flight, and went home. He later vanished from the public spotlight. Years passed before a journalist found him living in a quiet coastal village, running a community library, building toys for children, and helping orphaned kids learn tech. His wealth didn't vanish, it was reallocated. Kai had simply restructured his jar. Nora, the cancer warrior, was a rising fashion designer when her world turned upside down with a stage 3 cancer diagnosis at age 29 during chemo. She watched motivational talks to stay hopeful one evening. Bald and tired, she watched a video titled, "The Jar of Your Life." For the first time in weeks, she smiled. She wrote her rocks on the hospital wall: hope, family, art, God, gratitude. As months passed, Nora survived. She launched a clothing line for women fighting cancer, soft, beautiful, resilient designs. She held workshops and helped others see that beauty lives even through the pain. Her jar didn't shrink, it grew. Farid, the taxi philosopher in the streets of Istanbul. Farid was known as the taxi philosopher. He had been driving a cab for over 40 years. Every rider got a short ride, but a deep lesson. Farid always carried a jar on his dashboard. When asked about it, he'd say, "It reminds me who I am." His rocks, a photo of his late wife, a prayer, bead, a small book of poems, and his daughter's toy car. He had lost many things in life: money, friends, youth, but not his values. One day, a passenger was so touched by his story, she wrote a book about him. The last chapter simply read, He drove people for decades, but more than that, he drove hearts toward purpose. June. The teacher who never stopped giving in a rural African village, June was the only teacher. Her classroom had no electricity, broken chairs, and only a few books. But she had passion. Each year on the first day of school, she'd show her students a glass jar. She'd say, "This is your life. What you put in first matters most." June didn't earn much, but her students went on to become doctors, leaders, and educators. Every one of them credited her story, the story of the jar. When June passed away at 81, the village held a candlelight vigil. Hundreds came. In their hands they carried jars filled with stones and tears. One banner read, "Thank you for showing us how to fill our lives. You were our first rock." Asterisk, full circle years later, a young woman named Zoya, inspired by Professor Armin's teachings, becomes a life coach. She carries a glass jar to every end, filled with rocks, pebbles, and sand. One day a student asks, "Do you think this really works?" She smiles. "Not only does it work, it saved my life, and it will change yours too." The jar is passed down from generation to generation, not just as a symbol, but as a living truth. If you really like the story, please do like, share, subscribe, comment,